So Aitswail, Miatsapquaquilum, good day, everybody, and welcome. Thank you so much for being here for our very first ever open Lunch and Learn series that our company, Len Pierre Consulting, has launched as a new initiative to bring greater knowledge, greater awareness, and conversations to whomever this topic matters most, each and every one of you. So these are free Lunch and Learn sessions that are meant to be short and sweet snippets of an opportunity for you and all of us to engage in reconciliation conversations, decolonization conversations, and Indigenous cultural safety conversations. And with that, I would like to emphasize that I would love to keep this casual and conversational. So I invite you to ask any questions that you have off the top of your mind when it comes to transformative territorial acknowledgements. Before I get into it, I know that there are many new faces and names I am seeing in the chat box, and a lot of familiar faces. So I'm just going to introduce myself in my good way, as my elders have always reminded me to do so. So my name is Len Pierre. My ancestral name is Palikuluk, and I'm Coast Salish from Katie First Nation on my father's side and Musqueam First Nation on my mother's side. I am the owner and managing consultant with our consulting group, Len Pierre Consulting. We are a tiny but mighty Indigenous consulting firm specializing in projects, education and training for any willing organization across Turtle Island, North America, who want to roll up their sleeves and get into where cultural safety can exist for them, to get into the work of reconciliation and decolonization. We're a tiny but mighty group, but at the same time, we're also a very new group. This company, LPC, Len Pierre Consulting, started as a project off the side of my desk while I was working in the field of healthcare. And during the global pandemic and these never-ending Zoom meetings, I feel like it kind of grew into something I really couldn't have imagined. And so that's who I am and where I'm coming from. My background is primarily in the area of education, adult education, First Nations education, in the public school system and within the post-secondary domain. So I come to you this afternoon with an open heart and an open mind and hope to be received in the same way. I know that you have questions off the top of your mind. I know that you come to this space here wanting to, learn about how we can make our territorial acknowledgements more meaningful and give them more depth and breadth. And I hope to equip you with some pragmatic tools that you feel like you can put in your professional tool belt moving forward. So that's who I am in a nutshell. But with all due respect to your time, let's go ahead and jump right into our presentation here today. Today's session is focused on transformative territory acknowledgements, and I'll talk about why I included that transformative piece in the presentation. So bear with me one second here as I share my screen. Here we go. Okay, so before I get into my presentation here, I want to, and this is something that I do in my own professional practice, for those of you who teach or provide presentations or who chair meetings, one of the greatest cultural safety strategies I have embedded in my professional practice is to always begin so by opening up with your setting intention. Why are you here? What is the kind of space and what is the kind of experience you want to leave with your participants? And I invite all of you who hold space, who chair, who present, to begin with your intention setting. For myself, my intention here this afternoon is to create a safe space for exchanging knowledge and supporting one another in solidarity. I come with an open heart and an open mind, and I hope to be received in the same way. I do welcome questions throughout the entire presentation, but I promise you I will leave ample room to address any questions that you have following the end of the presentation as well. So you can definitely do both. So when it comes to territory acknowledgements, this presentation really started when I first started my consulting practice for cultural safety and reconciliation. I have clients, I'm so fortunate enough to say that I have clients all across North America, in any sector that scaffolds this country. I have clients in the ministries, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Transportation, schools and school districts throughout Canada, healthcare systems, justice systems, lawyer firms, you name the organization in Canada, we have probably talked to them at some point in the last 3 or 4 years. And one of the most number one questions I get asked when I'm coaching our clients and how to be leaning towards reconciliation and cultural safety is around the territory acknowledgement. A lot of people have asked me, Len, I've been doing the territory acknowledgement for some time now. And sometimes when I'm sitting in spaces listening to other people's acknowledgement, they go like way off script and they say these really cool things. And I'm like, I want to be in that spot. I want to be in that zone. Or sometimes clients will tell me, Len, I feel really awkward when I do the land acknowledgement. I don't know what to say. I'm afraid of mispronouncing things. To me, it feels so foreign and it feels so, I don't know, I just feel awkward when I do it. And I'm embarrassed to do it because I feel like people pick up on that when I'm saying my acknowledgement. And my response is always, that's okay. That's okay. That's okay. When you're in that zone of fear or hesitation or having a little bit of concern, that's kind of the magic zone you always want to be in when you're doing the territorial acknowledgement. And I say that as a First Nations man, professional who travels in North America, and I am constantly in different Indigenous territories that are not my own home territories. I'm always in that zone of, I'm afraid I'm going to mess it up. I'm afraid I'm going to say the wrong thing. I'm afraid that there might be a participant in the audience who is from that nation who's going to hear me mispronounce it, and I start sweating. So I just want to bring that into the space and say, there's always a little bit of fear, and there's always a little bit of awkwardness, but that's okay. We want to be in that magic zone because it'll keep us humble. So a lot of the reason for the awkwardness is we don't know why we're doing the territory acknowledgement. We don't know the missing context behind the territory acknowledgement. And more importantly, we don't know how we can add more depth and breadth and meaning to it. I'll be very transparent with you. I always say transparency is like my corporate superpower. I can't really turn it off. There is a healthy skepticism in our Indigenous communities where Indigenous folks will say things like, oh, the territory acknowledgement is superficial, or it's performative, or it's tokenistic. I'm just being transparent with you. There is some of that conversation that does happen in our communities, and that's okay too. Those are need to have conversations. But I would rather us all do the territory acknowledgement than not do it. Because not doing it would be going 30 steps in the wrong direction. It'd be like 1 step forward, 30 steps backward. That's what would happen if we did not do the territory acknowledgement. So we cannot let our fear or our concern or our hesitation deter us from doing the acknowledgement in itself. And so that's why I created this transformative territory acknowledgement presentation guide to support people in their own learning journey, wherever you feel like you're at in your learning journey for doing territory acknowledgements. And hopefully guiding you to this place where you feel like you can be more transformative, more inspiring, adding more meaningful meaning to your acknowledgement. So to begin, our conversation, why do we do the territory acknowledgement? Where does this come from, right? Why are we suddenly asked to do this little thing? And one of the things I want to say is that it seems new, right? The territory acknowledgements, I don't know if anybody remembers hearing them 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago. I mean, a couple of months ago, I went and attended a Canucks hockey game, and they did the territory acknowledgement. And I think there was a traditional welcome that was in there too. So they seem like really new initiatives, corporate initiatives, organizational initiatives, but territory acknowledgements are nothing new on Turtle Island. We as Indigenous peoples, to some degree, regarding no matter what your cultural background is, we have been doing some form of territorial acknowledgements for centuries in our traditional lands and territories. And the reason for that is, as Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, North America, we have a very deep visceral, intimate connection to land and territory. And that's, in tow with being the Indigenous, or the spiritual Indigenous peoples that we are. We as Indigenous peoples, we don't see the land as something that can be bought or sold or traded. We do that today because it's necessary to do today. But traditionally speaking, none of us looked at the land as something that could be exploited or owned. The saying is, we don't own the land, we borrow it from future generations. And our job is not to own the land, but to live in unity and synchronicity with the land, because the land is our mother, the land is our relative, the land is our ancestor, and keeps us alive. And as human beings, ultimately, we are nothing without the land, right? That's our framework on how we look at land and territory. So to have a territory is like to have a home. It's where your stories are. It's where your family is. That's how we look at land and territory. So we would honor and recognize that if I'm in a part of the world that is not where my stories are, that is not where my family is, that's somebody else's home. So I would honor and recognize that through a recognition or an acknowledgement. And to share with you a little bit of a story that I've learned from a relative of mine in Stolo territory. His name is, and you've probably heard of him before, the Honorable Stephen Point. I had an opportunity to listen to him once in a conversation around reconciliation, and he shared with me this very deep and intimate story about our connection to land as Huambok people, as Indigenous peoples. I learned from Stephen Point that, as Indigenous peoples in Coast Salish territory, traditionally speaking, we didn't bury our dead 6 feet in the ground in cemeteries like we do today. That's a colonial practice that we, adopted from residential schools and colonialism in this country. Traditionally speaking, we didn't bury our people 6 feet in the ground. What we would do is we would take our loved ones, and when they transitioned into the spirit world, we would wrap them in this fetal position and wrap them in cedar cloth, and then hang them in cedar trees and in certain caves in our traditional territory. And over time, the skin, the bone, the organs, the ligaments, everything would go back into Mother Earth. Because the teaching is we all come from Mother Earth, and one day we will all go back to Mother Earth. So if you can imagine, centuries and centuries and centuries of this cultural practice, every square inch of our traditional territory is covered in our relatives. It's covered in our ancestors. So when you're walking on Coast Salish territory or Katzie territory, Squamish territory, Musqueam territory, you're not walking on their land, you're walking on their ancestors. You're walking on our ancestors, right? And so when you see us out there marching and protesting and demonstrating against development in our land and in our territories, ask yourself for a moment, what would you do to protect your mother and father? What would you do to defend your grandmother and your grandfather? Right? Like, that's the deep visceral connection we have to territory. And I think that that is no small thing. I actually think that's a very beautiful thing. Imagine if we could teach this to human beings all across the planet, this beautiful relationship and connection a human being can have to land. Imagine if we taught this in the education system today. From kindergarten to grade 12, we taught every student, whether they're Indigenous or not, this beautiful relationship human beings can have to the land and territory. When they grow up, right, and they become the next prime minister or the next premier or the next CEO of a major energy company, how different do you think our response would be to the climate catastrophe on this planet, right? That's the beauty of reconciliation. That's the beauty of decolonization work, is we can tap into an Indigenous worldview and see things, really important things like the environment through the lens of Indigenous peoples, through our values. That's our connection to land and territory. I also remember when I was a teenager growing up on reserve in my home community of Katzie, I remember wanting to learn my language, and I would go to my grandmother often, who was a matriarch in our community, I would ask her, I'm like, Grandma, what's the word for human being in our language? Because I wanted to go teach my friends that word. And so she said, well, the word for human being is kwamach. Kwamach is the word for human being. I was like, thank you. I was going to go off and tell my friends. And she was like, wait a minute, get back here. And I was like, oh, hell. And she said, that's the literal translation for the word human, but our meaning of the word is different. And I was like, well, what do you mean by that? And she said, our word for human being, kwamach, means human being of the land. We are people of the land. And if you can internalize just a portion of that, right, that we in our worldview of what it means to be human means that we are nothing without the land and territories in which we belong to. Again, it's a part of our identity, it's a part of our DNA. So that's our connection to territory acknowledgements, is that, 2,000 years ago, if I ever went into a home in a territory that was not my own, and I was there with my family and maybe my community, and we wanted to do work like a ceremony or go hunting or fishing to feed ourselves lunch for that afternoon, I would honor and recognize that this is not my home. This is not my territory. So I would recognize whose land and territories that we were on. And it's been a cultural practice of ours across Turtle Island for centuries. It's only emerged in the mainstream Canadian sector because we as Indigenous leaders have said, we think that, guests and visitors and settlers on our lands and territories should be doing that too, because it's a part of our humility. It's a part of our courtesy and how to be good neighbors and good community members for this. So why do we do the territory acknowledgement? Number one, we want to ground people before we work with them, right? It's the same reason we do opening prayers as Indigenous folks, or when we sing a song, or we have an elder welcome us to the territory. It's the same thing when we do territory acknowledgements. It grounds us in where we are in this part of the world. And I think that's something that we lose sight of in the 21st century. We feel more connected than ever with our use of our social media. We feel super connected, but we're also incredibly disconnected from our land and territory. So we want to build that foundation back into the work that we do as human beings. As professionals we are, we come from the land and territory, right? And it keeps us alive. Let's ground ourselves in that sameness. It's to ground people in the sense of place and space, to demonstrate our professional commitment to reconciliation and recognition of Indigenous peoples and territory. And more importantly, I really like to look at the territory acknowledgement as exercising our modesty, our kindness, humbleness, and courtesy. I've learned this from my friend and colleague, Marissa, who will be presenting at the next Lunch and Learn. She taught me this really cool metaphor. She's like, well, when you're doing the territory acknowledgement, it's kind of like when your friend invites you over for dinner or cocktails, right? When your friend hosts you in their house, and when you're leaving your friend's house, as you're heading out the door, what do you say to your host? You say, thank you. Thank you for having us. Why do you think we say thank you? Why do you think we have the calling to say, express our gratitude and our appreciation? Well, I think it's so that we show that we have some good manners about us, right? And so I also look at the territory acknowledgement as that courtesy, right? We're in somebody's home, somebody's territory, somebody's relationship to that land that is far older than us, far older than Canada. Canada is 156, I think. Well, our communities that we mention in our territory acknowledgements are thousands and thousands of years old next to the infancy of Canada. My own nation is more than 14,000 years old in our lands and territories. So we're old, we're ancient, we've been here for some time. And so when people do the territorial acknowledgement, you're expressing that gratitude and appreciation and recognition that we've been here for a long time. And there's a lot of strength in that. Okay, let's talk a little bit about why the territory acknowledgements sometimes feel really superficial or feel performative or feel tokenistic. I just want to prepare people for this next part. This is where we get to the harder to have conversations, but this is what you signed up for. Don't forget, right? This is often the missing context behind territory acknowledgements. If non-Indigenous peoples feel like there's an emptiness to their territorial acknowledgement, One of the biggest things for that is the lack of common knowledge and common understanding on how we've been disconnected from our own lands and territories in this very free, very progressive, liberal, kind, and multicultural country. Sadly, in the year 2023, it's not common knowledge that Canadian citizens understand state violence against Indigenous folks in this country. Sadly, in the 21st century, not a lot of Canadian citizens know about the atrocities of the past, like the residential schools, 60 Scoop, genocide, biological warfare against Indigenous folks. And so without that knowledge, without that same shared understanding, that's where we feel the emptiness in the shell. People are doing the territory acknowledgements without understanding what has happened up until this point. And so we want to bring those into the space so that people are making informed decisions when they're doing their acknowledgements. So what we're really talking about here is ultimately, at the end of the day, right, let's name it and bring it into the space. Canada has a relentless intergenerational track record for constantly trying to erase us as Indigenous peoples. I mean, through the White Paper policy in 1969, Pierre Trudeau, in partnership with the Minister of Indian and Northern Affairs at the time, who would later become our Prime Minister, Jean Chrétien, created the White Paper policy. The White Paper policy would have erased Indigenous identity. There would be no First Nations, no Métis, no Inuit peoples in Canada today with the stroke of a pen, because they wanted to assimilate us into the dominant Canadian narrative. The potlatch ban made it illegal for us to speak our language, to sing our songs, to dance our dances, to gather in numbers greater than 6 or more, because Canada wanted to wipe out our culture from existence. And for those of you who've been in Canada for some time, like if you're in your 40s, 50s, 60s, or 70s, right? Do you remember learning a lot about Indigenous peoples in your elementary school years or your high school years? No. If you did, you were really, really lucky, right? I'm 36 and I didn't have a lot of opportunity to learn about what it means to be a Coast Salish person in education. So it's not that way by accident. It was made that way by design. Canada did not want an educated population to know about the atrocities of against Indigenous folks. So that's what I call forced erasure of Indigenous folks. The amount of land theft that actively sustains oppression in this country. All the land in Canada has been stolen and occupied since the dawn of contact. And with that land theft comes oppression. So we wonder why Indigenous folks are overrepresented in poverty and the connection between poverty and negative health outcomes or societal inequities like mental health, substance use, overdose deaths, the spread of HIV, hepatitis C, obesity, kidney disease. You know, that overrepresentation comes from the theft of Indigenous lands and territories. Common misconception is, well, Indigenous peoples are getting a free ride because we get Canadian taxpayer dollars. No, there's no such thing as that. That's a myth. That's misinformation perpetuated by colonial ideology. There's not a single penny of taxpayer dollars that goes towards First Nations communities. That comes from a royal trust fund that was established generations ago. And the opposite is actually, in fact, when you take into consideration the vast amount of lands that have been stolen from Indigenous folks, where billions, if not trillions of dollars have been removed in terms of revenue or resources that have been extracted, right? The business and monies that are earned on Indigenous lands and territories, where not a single penny of that goes towards First Nations communities, Métis communities, and Inuit communities, right? And so Wab Kinew says it best, and he's like, well, who's really getting the free ride here, right? So again, missing parts of the conversation, but often perpetuated through myths and stereotypes that are colonial in ideology. So what we're really talking about here is state and structural violence against Indigenous folks. And this is reinforced with capitalism and corporate exploitation as well. This is why our conversations feel so shallow and they feel performative, especially if we have folks who are doing the territory acknowledgement without this knowledge, without access to these conversations. This is why we wanted to make this learning open and accessible to all of our professional colleagues across Canada, so that we can add more meaning and depth and breadth to our territory acknowledgements. So this is why it can sometimes feel awkward. Okay, so that's where our territory acknowledgements come from. This is why they feel awkward. Let's talk about some do's and don'ts when we're doing the territory acknowledgement, and then I will turn my attention to the chat box and answer some of the questions that you have. So there are some do's and don'ts. There are some promising practices for this work. And this is informed largely by friends, colleagues, elders, community members that I have access to when we're engaging in conversations that we're talking about what we like and what we don't like when we're listening to territory acknowledgements. So let's start with the do's. Do say territory over land acknowledgement. So Harmon in the chat box or in the Q&A box was asking me, what's the difference between a land acknowledgement and a territory acknowledgement? A land acknowledgement is wonderful. I feel like that's like the go-to terminology, right? Everybody's like, what about the land acknowledgement? Or who's going to do the land acknowledgement? And I'm like, okay, land acknowledgement. I say call it a territory acknowledgement over a land acknowledgement. Because are you really acknowledging the land at the end of the day? No. What you're really acknowledging is somebody's relationship to that land that is far older than you, far older than your profession and your organization, and a lot older than the context of Canada. So when you use the word territory, it implies that relationship to territory. So I invite folks all the time to retire the word land acknowledgement, because you're not recognizing the land, you're recognizing the people's relationship to that land, which is the territory. And I say that because language is no small thing. Language is this thing that constructs our thoughts construct our beliefs, and our beliefs inform how we will treat one another as human beings. So if we're a little bit more intentional with the language we use, then we get that much more further. I hear land acknowledgement all the time, but I don't believe in call out culture. I don't believe in, all these other cancel cultures and those kinds of things. There's always just more promising practices that we can encounter on our learning journey moving forward. And I've called them land acknowledgements before too, but I find the territory acknowledgement as the terminology more meaningful at the end of the day. Do have your most senior leader say the acknowledgement. So usually this is done by your head honcho. It's the person with the most seniority in your organization who should be doing the territory acknowledgement. Often when I'm hosting virtual gatherings or conferences or meetings, I invite my participants to share their own acknowledgement in the chat box. It's a way for them to ground themselves and to demonstrate their learning too. You as the host of that virtual meeting will always do yours, but I often invite my participants to share their own acknowledgement as well. And then of course, do ask non-Indigenous colleagues for advice. There's this little thing called the burden of representation. In a time of truth and reconciliation, a lot of people are like busting down the doors of their Indigenous colleagues saying, oh, can I ask you for some advice? Or can you educate me, right? Which is great, that's wonderful. We've been asking to be in these spaces and at these tables for a long, long, long time. And then all of a sudden it's like the floodgates opened and now everybody wants to, ask and learn. And that's great, that's a wonderful thing. But at the same time, we also want to create a culture of learning where non-Indigenous peoples, there's a lot of room for you here in this space too to help support that learning moving forward. I call that good allyship, and I call that good cultural advocacy, where you as a non-Indigenous person can share your teachings, share the experiences that you've learned by Indigenous leaders and educators, and help carry on that learning so that we can alleviate that burden off of Indigenous hearts and minds and spirits. So before you ask an Indigenous colleague or friend, do check in with people who you think might also have the answer to. So allies, advocates, people who've been invested in this work for a long time. Don't forget to tap on their shoulders and ask them for their knowledge and their wisdom too. Please do not ask Indigenous peoples to do the Indigenous recognition or the territorial acknowledgement. And at the same time, please don't ask Indigenous staff or Indigenous departmental personnel to do the territory acknowledgement. Again, that protocol should go towards the leader of the organization. And if it's not the leader of the organization, it's your host, your MC, or the chair of the meeting. You usually should do it. That's the difference between a welcome, a traditional welcome, and a territorial acknowledgement. A traditional welcome should always be done by an elder or Indigenous person or an Indigenous leader in the organization. The acknowledgement should be done by non-Indigenous peoples who are in places of power and privilege and leadership. So that's the difference. And sometimes organizations get the two mixed up, the welcome versus the territory protocol. Protocol, non-Indigenous people do. Welcome, Indigenous peoples do. And then, of course, do watch out for ornamental language, right? Like, we would like to give thanks to Katzie First Nation to live, laugh, and love on their territory. Please don't say anything like that. That came up in a social media post. I don't know if anybody's seen that in a social media post of mine on Facebook where an organization had done that. Again, I think very well intended, but missing the context for these conversations. So do watch out for those. So here's how I would encourage folks to add more breadth and depth to their territory acknowledgement. I use this as a 3-point scale. And when I say this is a 3-point scale, it's not that you should be in one particular zone. I myself use this as a scale to pick and choose which kind of recognition or acknowledgement I want to use based on the environment in which I am doing that acknowledgement. So the first part of the scale is your standard recognition. Your standard recognition is where you probably read from a script. The recognition is approved and endorsed by your organization and the leaders in your organization, and it probably takes you less than 10 seconds to do. And this is usually the one we see in all of our email signatures, right? It says, we would like to honor and recognize that Fraser Health provides care on the unceded territories of the Nglakmuk and Coast Salish nations. Less than 10 seconds. And that's your standard. That's where we want everybody to be. We want all professionals, right? No matter what your domain is to be in that standard zone of recognizing the territory. When you're comfortable with that and you're like, I feel like I can build it out a little bit more. I feel like I can make it a little bit more meaningful. Then you can progress into the second stage of the reflective recognition. This, I would say, is a little bit more intermediate. Step 1, the standard recognition, is for beginners. Number 2 is more intermediate. So I call this a reflective recognition. A reflective recognition, includes your own cultural identity. It offers your own personal reflections on your relationship to the land and territory, your relationship to what you're learning about the local nations that you are listing in your acknowledgement, or a demonstration of your learning. So if you're acknowledging Katzie First Nation, which is my home territory, what is your cultural identity? Well, you can say, oh, I'm, a second generation settler of French and English ancestry. I've been residing on Katzie traditional lands and territories for the last 2 years. And I learned through this really weird guy, Len Pierre, to lunch and learn that he shared with us, that the word Katzie actually translates into English as the land of moss, because Katzie in our language means the land of moss. So before the concrete in the cars and the glass, our territory was covered in this green, resilient, spongy moss. And so the people would identify this place as the land of moss. And I learned that. So you're role modeling your learning to the participants who are listening to your territory acknowledgement. And so often that's where I say step 1, if you want to build out a reflective recognition, what do the meanings of the nations you're listing, right? Tawasin means something. Semiahmoo means something. Kwantlen means something, right? And thanks to the magic of the internet, you can easily type in or ask people, right, in your organization, what those place names mean, and bring them into your acknowledgement. And then from there, if you want to progress and you really want to blow it out of the park, you can land on the third stage, which is what I call an advanced recognition. And this is a transformative recognition. A transformative recognition is where you go off script because there's something of value when you go off script, right? You're speaking from the heart. It includes a recognition of ongoing colonialism, oppression, racism, and a commitment to reconciliation and justice doing, or good allyship. So these are the harder to have conversations. But again, you're alleviating that burden on Indigenous folks to be the only ones talking about racism, the only ones talking about colonialism. And in your transformative recognition, you could say things like, I have learned, that colonization is not a thing of the past. Colonialism is alive and well. I am committed to reconciliation in my professional practice, or this organization, this team, my team is committed to embedding culturally safer practices in our area of work. And so I intend to make sure that our territory acknowledgements are not shallow, superficial, or performative, but we are committed to justice doing. That's where you build it out. And as Indigenous peoples, those are like our favorite recognitions, because we're like, we're not the only ones having those conversations, right? We're not the only ones having the difficult conversations. So when we see you as non-Indigenous peoples being brave and calling deep on your courage to say those things and bring them into the space, you make it that much more real. You make it that much more tangible. And it doesn't have to be all doom and gloom. It's about reconciliation, right? It's about justice doing. But when you're naming those things, because they're real, right? Oppression is real, racism is real. So let's have real conversations. That's why they feel so superficial, is because we pretend they're not real when we know they are. But when we name them and we bring them into the space, we create a culture where we can talk about them. And in those cultures where we can talk about them, we can address them and work with them. That's how I would look at the 3-point scale. Now, just because this is a 3-point scale doesn't mean that I would expect all, 286 of us to be always doing level 3, the advanced version, right? I don't do the level 3 advanced version every single day, every single time I do the territory recognition. Sometimes I scale it back, but I go to a standard recognition, or sometimes I scale it up and land on a reflective recognition. This I would just look as 3 tools that you get to pick from. You don't have to, you get to pick 3 different tools based on the event that you are doing your recognition. So here's an example of a transformative territory acknowledgement. I'm not going to read it because I broke my own teacher rule and put way too many screens on the screen here, or too many words on the screen here. But I will let you know where you can find this example of a transformative one. What you do see is that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 paragraphs for their transformative territorial acknowledgement. This is taken from their website at New Society Publishers, Nanaimo, Vancouver Island. So if you just Google that, you're going to find the territory recognition right there. And this is a classic example of a transformative. They're talking about things like crown lands. They're talking about their responsibilities as settlers. They're talking about things like investing into decolonization, celebrating, uplifting Indigenous peoples of these lands and territories. That is like 10 out of 10 score for a transformative territory acknowledgement. Okay, here's some tools that I just wanted to start sending your way with the little bit of time that we have. Hopefully this is meaningful for each and every one of you. Even if you're walking away with one thing, I'm happy with that. Here are some things that you can do. There's this really cool resource, which I have a little bit of a bias on. My cousin and my brother Raid and I had a wonderful opportunity to create a business edition reconciliation workbook for professionals. It's called Critter, Connecting Resilience, Indigenous Truth and Reconciliation. And it's a guide for organizations who want to, mobilize the work of reconciliation in their businesses, in their areas of work. And in this book, you will see that there is a tool for writing out your own land acknowledgement. So if you're in stage 1, right, you're wondering what words to put on the paper, there's a guide here to help you write out your land acknowledgement, your territory acknowledgement. So a really great starting point. And so for folks who are asking your good questions, I will have a draw at the end of the session and send you 2 draws, right? And I will send you a free copy of our Critter, Connecting Resilience, Indigenous Truth and Reconciliation business workbook. the business edition. So keep those questions coming. What else can you do? We have a transformative territory acknowledgement guide, which is on our website under resources. I will let you know where to find that at the very end of this presentation. This session is also being recorded and will be available on YouTube as a learning resource. We had 500 people register for this session. We had 2,000 people who could not make it into this open online webinar. 2,000. That's a lot of people who are going to feel left out of the conversation. So I will offer a part 2 or a second go of this webinar, but we'll also make this video shareable as well if you find it meaningful to share with your teams, your organizations, any friends, or of course on your social media as well. And yesterday I recorded our very first podcast on transformative territory acknowledgements, which will also be available on the website later on as well. So with that, I'm going to open up the floor to any questions, comments, reflections, and sharing that you have. We have about 17 minutes to engage in an open dialogue. If you would like access to these slides, they are available on my website at lenpierreconsulting.com. Just go under the presentations tab and scroll down to transformative territory acknowledgements. The transformative guide is also available on our website under resources, and you'll find a printable and shareable PDF version so that you can share on in the learning. And if you would like access to other future Lunch and Learn sessions, I invite folks to follow me on either Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn at this time, where is largely where we promote the future webinars that we will be hosting as our LPC team. Our next session in 2 weeks will be hosted by Marissa McIntyre, my friend and colleague, on cultural appropriation versus appreciation. And with that, we're able to engage like 2,500 people. And so right now, social media is the best way to stay informed and on top of these sessions. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and start turning my attention to the Q&A box here. 1 second. Okay, in the school setting where teachers are meeting students every day, can land acknowledgements be done every day or whenever they meet in class? So I look at territory acknowledgements as a formality, right? A formality is where you're setting the tone, you're setting the intention. And of course, it's also that balance with courtesy as well. So you don't want them to be overly redundant by doing them every single day in every single meeting. So this I say to my teams all the time when I was working at Fraser Health, First Nations Health Authority. If we're a team that meets weekly, we don't need to do the territory acknowledgement every single day because then it becomes redundant and we're all new in that space. If you have a guest visitor come in, that's where you want to demonstrate your courtesy and your manners, right? That you are on your learning journey, that you have a commitment to the territory acknowledgement. That's where I would say, okay, let's do the territory acknowledgement if we have a guest in the space. Why? Because we want to demonstrate our manners. We want to demonstrate our teaching and our learning and our commitment. So that's how I would look at it. They don't have to be daily routine. Weekly routine, absolutely, if it's for your school. I know a lot of schools sometimes do the territory acknowledgement before the Canadian anthem, if they choose to do the Canadian anthem at all these days. That's how I would look at that. Great question. I'm grateful for this knowledge you are sharing. I am a settler who was raised on Secwepemc territory, unceded and occupied, and feel that I have a connection through my family who continues to live there. I've lived in different places on Turtle Island and North and South America. Significant to me. I've wondered if I could also acknowledge that territory in addition to the territories I've often enjoyed from. Thank you. Yes, Patricia, great question. So often when people are doing territory acknowledgements, another key part of coming together for the purpose of working together are your introductions. When you'll notice when you're in Indigenous contexts where Indigenous folks are when we're introducing ourselves, we'll tell you our whole life story sometimes. Some of us will tell you our whole life story on where we come from. That's part of our cultural upbringing. That's part of our cultural values. I say that because a big part of our work when we're working together is before we even get to the work, we want to make sure that we're in good relations. Then we'll get to the work. And a big part of getting to the good relationship part is getting to know who you are and where you come from. So often when I'm in a meeting space and I'm chairing a space, I will say, introduce yourself in your good way. You can share your ancestry or cultural identity, or you can share your origin story. Where do you come from? Right? Not necessarily your ethnic or cultural background. Maybe it's your professional background, and say that you've worked in, North America, South America, which territories that you've had the opportunity to live, work, and play. When you bring those into the space, we're getting to know a little bit about who you are and where you come from. Because if you've been born and raised in a certain part of the world, and somebody on the opposite side of the table says, oh, I was also born and raised in that part of the world, then we're finding the relationship connections, right? So I do encourage folks to add more origin stories to their roundtable introductions as well. So feel free to bring that in the space. Not so much as your formal recognition, but a part of your origin story is definitely welcome and worth sharing. What are your thoughts on including the Métis in territory acknowledgements? Although they aren't from BC, they do have regions and charter communities on these lands that could also be acknowledged. Absolutely, great question. And so often we look at inclusion here, right? So the territory acknowledgement is not the same thing as honoring and recognizing the inclusion of Métis communities. They're two distinct things. So a lot of people will say things, and this is the pitfall. People will honor the land-based nations, right? Like let's say Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and the two Métis charter communities. And then the Indigenous or the First Nations folks in the space will be like, hold up, they have no traditional lands and territories here. So you want to make sure that there's a pause or a distinction in your recognition that is not confusing your participants by saying that Métis peoples have traditional lands and territories in that context of British Columbia, right? Because Métis traditional lands and territories are in the eastern parts. So we want to make sure that we're being clear and concise with that and not confusing them, because that's not necessarily going to set you up in the best space. Should one of the members from one of those local land-based nations be present. So I would say something like do your territory acknowledgement protocol. Like I would like to honor and recognize that we are working today on the traditional unceded territories of Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish. Pause. Before I begin, I would also like to honor and recognize that we do have it in our hearts and minds to work in spirit and partnership and honor and recognize the two Métis chartered communities who also call this place home as well. And we have the honor of working with or alongside. So you want to see how I buffered that in between. You don't want to confuse them by throwing them into the territory acknowledgement there. Hopefully that helps. My understanding, which may be inaccurate, is that the territories were inhabited by different nations at different times over the centuries. Therefore, I wonder which nations I should be acknowledging. Should I state as represented today by or not? Really great question. Absolutely. And this is work that we have to do on our end as Indigenous folks. Okay. So this is something that we're working on as Indigenous nations, is where, because ultimately, and here's some, potentially new knowledge, we didn't have boundaries, like these clear drawn out lines in our traditional territories, right? There was significant overlap. And that's why we say things like shared traditional territory. Today, it's like where one city ends, another begins, right? There's that hard line, that hard stop. That was not so across Turtle Island before colonization, right? So now through oppression and structural violence, and now governance and politics with land-based nations, there's all of these overlapping boundaries. So it's not up to us to determine what that is when we're doing the territory acknowledgement. That's why we're going to want to do some homework, and usually organizations are really great at doing that. If there's conflict, if there's confusion, a strategy getting around that might be using a broader umbrella term to talk about people. So people do that in the Lower Mainland when we say things like Coast Salish nations. Sometimes if there's political tension between the overlapping nations' territories, some people use the linguistic family to honor and recognize that we're on the traditional lands and territories of the Sinchothan, Hunkaminam speaking peoples. That's an example of getting around that. So bring that back to the team and do workshop it a little bit, and then check in with some of the local Indigenous nations to make sure that your acknowledgement is aligned with their values and principles. Because That's some waters that you might need to navigate, but not all of us will be in that stage. Should these be done at any and all events? I've been doing them for all of my podcast interviews, and we've been doing them at our staff meetings, but should we do them at smaller meetings and so on? If you get the gist. Yes, and thank you to all of my friends at CBI Consultants. It's good to see you all. Again, yes, for formal events like podcasts, like formal meetings, conferences, absolutely include them in there. But if it's very routine where it's like, oh my gosh, we're the same group of people that never change, like your team meetings, your smaller team meetings, you don't need to do them that much, right? When your team's coming together, absolutely you want to do that formality, but I wouldn't say you need to do that at the smaller micro type of level. Again, think about them as manners and courtesy. And if you're a team, do you want to demonstrate those manners and that courtesy? And if you ever feel the calling, go with your gut instinct too. Sometimes you go to conferences and every single keynote or every single presenter will do the territory acknowledgement, even after there's been a welcome and a formal acknowledgement. That's because they feel that in their calling, right? That's because they feel it, that they want to demonstrate what they're learning. So don't feel like it's going to be overdone or redundant if you just feel the calling that you need to. Follow your gut instinct as well. It's like saying please and thank you, right? You're going to want to say please and you're going to want to say thank you when you want to because it's yours. Wondering if you have a mixed group of Indigenous, non-Indigenous staff, would you offer your Indigenous colleagues to do the territory acknowledgement or ask the senior? Yes. Okay, so thank you for that. And so that one we covered in previous slides, right? I don't recommend asking Indigenous folks or Indigenous leaders to do the acknowledgement, but your most senior leader. And Indigenous professionals will know this, that if they are hosting, they know it's on them to do the territorial acknowledgement and the welcome, not the welcome, but the acknowledgement. Oh, there you go. Yeah, I'm catching up on the questions. No disrespect intended, I'm sorry, but I have to leave. Okay, no worries. It's okay. Is it okay to say we are privileged to live, work, and play? Absolutely, it's definitely okay. And do check in with your colleagues too, right? Check in with each other because there is a privilege, right? And you're naming it and you're bringing it into the space. When we have the conversations around allyship, you know, eventually, not now, not tomorrow, you know, it will not be enough to just name our privilege, right? It's wonderful that we name them. These are early days, but eventually start to also think about if you're saying, you're mentioning your privilege, you're naming it, what are you going to use your privilege for? How are you going to use your privilege for reconciliation? Again, it's not like you have to do something immediately following this lunch and learn or by the end of the week, but start to ask yourself that question. Thank you for naming your privilege, but what are you going to use your privilege for? And so that's where Indigenous allyship, because that'll probably be a future lunch and learn session as well that we will unpack and explore. One of the things I would recommend not saying in your territory acknowledgements is thanking Indigenous nations for letting us be here. Unless you have that hard stop, full stop, express permission by the chief, the council, and all of the membership. Which nobody's probably ever going to have in this country, right? So but I do hear it more often than not, where people express gratitude or for the permission, right? Because I don't think there is gratitude and there's no permission. You might have gratitude, right? But the permission definitely probably wasn't there because if we look back at, you know, centuries worth of colonialism and institutional oppression. But I do hear that in some recognition, so something to watch out for. Should we put the territory acknowledgement in our email signatures? Absolutely. I love seeing the territory acknowledgements, use of your pronouns in your acknowledgements as well, or not in your acknowledgements, but your e-signatures, wonderful places to embed them. I would also say to add your territory acknowledgements to some type of physical environment. Do you have a lobby? Do you have a weight room? Do you have a boardroom where you can either create a mural or a plaque or an art piece that hardwires the territory acknowledgement into the physical place? At Fraser Health, they're starting to embed the territory acknowledgement into like all clinics, all emergency rooms, all meeting spaces, so that it becomes alive and well as well. So you can also put them into physical places as well. Is it appropriate to say live, work, and play, or is that the same? I would say it's appropriate, definitely appropriate. You live here, you work here, you play here, but really start to think about how you can build out the live, work, and play, right? Bring your children into it, bring your families into it, your fur babies. Do you take your fur babies down to the lake, down to the river, down to the ocean? What is the connection there between land and territory? Start to build that out and really bring yourself, your identity into your territory acknowledgement. I often say, for me to unwind and de-stress and decompress from work, I go to the river, and that's where my people's stories are. If that's the same for you, you say, I've learned this is where the stories are of those people. That was a lot of me catching up on questions, but I see that there's a hand up, so I'm going to ask you to ask your question if it's okay, Natika.
Hi, it's Natika, and my question is, how do you give a territory acknowledgement for a nation that doesn't have a land base? So, for example, quiet at New Westminster.
Yeah, Kakite.
Oh yes, sorry. I'm so I've been in meetings all day. I'm like, Kakite. Yes. Sorry.
No worries. Great question. And so you can just honor and recognize that those are the traditional territories of Kakite. And it's totally up to you on your willingness and your comfort level, readiness level to go into being able to address and respond to any questions about, Kakite not having an original land base because of colonization. So there are many organizations that do offer the recognition of Kakite as a traditional unceded territory. So for example, Fraser Health has also a territory acknowledgement guide that I helped write that is a part of there. And so it has them as listed as one of the land-based nations. They just don't happen to have a reservation that's applied to it, but you don't need a reservation to have that traditional land there. For example, in Kwantlen First Nation, right? Kwantlen First Nation has their government office located in Langley, right? But they have traditional territories in Pitt Meadows and Surrey, which is where Catesy is affiliated. So the traditional sense is we've traditionally used and occupied those territories. We have a relationship there. So you can absolutely mention Kakite as having traditional unceded territories there. Okay. We're also thinking some more folks could have the opportunity to have these at repeat events, which doesn't align with senior leaders. Okay. Yes, absolutely. Hi, Bed. Okay. Can you hear some feedback? Okay, I'm just doing this last little scan. Will I be able to share this recording with your organization when it's finished? Yes, absolutely. So I'm going to stop it there because we are right at time, and I don't want to bring this on much longer than I have to. Hopefully that has been meaningful for everybody. Let me know in the chat box. I see, yes, this was great. We do want to continue our learning. Feel free to give me a follow on Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn. Shoot me a message if there's other feedback that you have for us. You have my email that I left. You have our website. You know where to find us. Send me ideas for future lunch and learn sessions that you want to offer. This is the first of many that our team wants to make available to continue your learning in your good way. So I just want to end by saying, thank you all. I raise my hands to you. Thank you for being here out of your very busy schedules. Your presence here matters, and your participation here matters. So thank you for attending our very first Lunch and Learn workshop. Have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Thank you, everybody. Bye.